The No Kings protest this weekend. Mondays with Mike.
Mondays with Mike. Mondays with Mike.
So then there was the No Kings protest this weekend. 7 million people attended. There were hundreds or thousands of places in which they could have attended. Speaker Mike Johnson said on Monday, if President Trump were a king, the government would be open right now. Like, we know that he doesn't have monarchical authority, but the worry is that he would like to have monarchical authority, or at least be an autocrat, and that he is attempting to act this way, pushing the limits and norms with the hope that these limits and norms would give way. I would say that's probably, if some, 80% of people from the rallies would hear it, they would say, yeah, that's about right. By the way, did you go? I wanted to go, but I had childcare responsibilities. Maybe I'll go next time. Maybe I'll go, if it happens on a nice summer's day, or spring, May Day. But, so the assumption is that he wants to be like a king. But is it wise to act as though we can read his mind? The short of this question is, are people protesting because option one of the autocratic behavior of the administration currently, two, because of perceived ambitions at greater autocracy, or three, because they don't like the current policy outcomes. I wonder, what the No Kings protest is all about.
So I was curious about it too. I read the history of how it started, and it actually originated from the first Trump administration. A bunch of staffers working on Capitol Hill wrote a handbook on how to resist nonviolently to the policies and actions of the first Trump administration. Essentially, it's a democratic nonviolence movement to extol the values and virtues of democracy and civic participation and the fabric of society, that we're better when we work together to address issues than when we are divided. And so this is a continuation actually of that. Of the group that's leading the charge is called Indivisible, and the No Kings protest is actually a coalition of a couple hundred different organizations that are all on the same page, that we care a lot about things like civil rights and civil liberties, and that the Trump administration is undermining those things in a variety of ways. So one of those ways is the rescissions of appropriated funds from Congress. So you've seen this with the complete shutdown of foreign aid early on in the administration, where they just disbanded USAID pretty much. And you saw it with some of the rescissions that they're doing on various projects. I think early on in the administration, they tried to shut down all grants and all loans of all federal projects overnight. It's like, no, you can't do that. And so what they've been doing instead is they've been trying to whittle away the edges of various things. And you saw that most prominently, most recently, with the colleges. The Trump administration is in an ongoing saga with a lot of universities where they're essentially dictating to them, you have to do certain things or you will lose all of your funding, all of it. Harvard right now is suing. I think they're still in their lawsuit. And a bunch of these other universities are in an ongoing disagreement with the Trump administration, where the Trump administration is essentially telling them, you will do these things or else, or you lose all your money. That very much is like a sort of illiberal, anti-democratic thing, expressly infringe on the academic freedom of universities and academic institutions. Because in a free society, ostensibly, the government doesn't tell these colleges and universities much to do at all, other than protect students and enforce the laws on the books. Telling them what to teach, what to think, how to act, those are things that are not reserved for the government at all. That's the stuff that monarchy, like absolutist countries do, of telling you how to live your life completely, how to eat, how to live, how to breathe, how to act. That is not a free democratic society. And so the No Kings protest very much along those lines of respect the civil rights and freedoms that the people have to live their lives as they see fit, so long as they're following the laws, right? Free speech, free association, just there's a list of things. And right now, those things are being trampled on for sure. But to your question of whether he's acting in an autocratic way, the answer to that is yes. If you listen to the speech that was given to the military leaders about using the U.S. cities as testing grounds, as far as I can tell, what that is a trial run of invoking the Insurrection Act, of installing the military in cities, which seems to be in direct contravention of the Posse Comitatus Act. Essentially, you can't use the military to domestic law enforcement. You're not supposed to, anyways. There are exceptions. Reconstruction after the Civil War is an exception. It has been used. So the integration of schools was a pretty good example of when the National Guard was used to tell states, look, you can't keep segregating schools. You have to integrate. Period. Rodney King riots to try and bring back some stability to Los Angeles. Katrina, right? Post Katrina, when there was complete anarchy and looting and rioting. If you want to watch a really great show about Katrina, watch 5 Days at Memorial about Memorial Hospital in New Orleans, where they got surrounded by floodwaters. You had a whole bunch of people stranded in a hospital, and they had to make some really extreme decisions as to how to help terminally ill patients and a bunch of other stuff. And it's brutal. But the point is, there are circumstances where, yes, government intervention is called for and even wanted, asked for, right? After a natural disaster, like a fire, hurricane, tornado, earthquake, right? You need help. You need to provide some structure, some stability to help people rebuild their lives. But what isn't happening in these cities is that. What's happening, as far as I can tell, is that Trump's flexing his power to try and get people inured, to get people to accept a new normal of the military being a constant presence in their everyday lives. I was a military dependent growing up. I spent a good portion of my early childhood and teen years on military bases, going to school at military bases. And I understand that life on a military base was much different than the civilian world. To give you a few examples, when I lived on a military base, we often had emergency drills, right? So, what happens if there's a bomb threat? What happens if somebody's attacking the base? What happens if there's a fire? And they would have us constantly where to hide, how to hide, where to go, who to talk to as kids, as military dependents. Because the deal is that the military base was a target, right? Because it's a military base, technically in a time of war, it would be a target. There is a tangible difference between living on a military base and living in the civilian world. For example, you had to have an ID at all times, and that ID had to be current. And to get onto the base, there were armed guards. You had to go through that checkpoint to get on the base. For instance, we lived off base. We lived in a city that wasn't on the military base, and we commuted to the base every day for school, for the Dodd School, for elementary school. And so every day we had to go through the checkpoint every single day. Most people, once I moved to civilian life, that's not your everyday. Every day when I went to school that wasn't on a military base, your everyday is not getting used to seeing armed guards and machine guns, right, all around. But what Trump is doing right now is making that the everyday experience of people, of having armed police forces with live rounds, right, at all times. If you create a society where people get used to that sort of everyday thing, it becomes easier to erode the rights and freedoms that people expect that they can exercise. They always face that ever present risk of violence. Now, we see some elements of that in society with law enforcement and police shootings, where cops occasionally shoot people in situations that didn't necessarily call for police, where you see too much violence being exercised in law enforcement, and that sucks. The deal there is that law enforcement, ostensibly, not in practice, but in theory, right? If it gets bad enough, people can fire all their cops. They can stop paying them by voting in politicians to disband the police department and just hire new people, fire everybody involved all along the chain. It's a thornier issue for something like the National Guard or the military because the people don't really have any mechanism other than electing a new president for stopping a military from targeting them. There is no deterrent, right? And so I think part of the issue with the No Kings protest is that you want to create this separation between the military interacting with civilians at all on US soil compared to law enforcement. Because at least for law enforcement, there is a check on their power. Not a good check. It's pretty terrible, but there at least is a check. But for the military, there isn't as much, right? They have their own system of justice. They have their own courts. They have their own judges. You can't just, in most cases, you cannot just sue the military for anything, right? Like they have their own separate system all on their own that most people will never interact with because they're not part of it. And if you want an extreme example of this, the US has something called a status of forces agreement when it has bases abroad, where what happens is that they make certain agreements with countries for how their soldiers are treated if something bad happens. So if a crime gets committed or something really dumb happens. And the example I think of is when a plane was flying in Italy and it sliced the wire on I think it's called a gondola, the elevated car that goes up a mountain, right, on a wire.
Cable car.
Cable car. A jet was flying in a place it wasn't supposed to be flying, sliced right through the cable car, bunch of people plummet to their death. Did that pilot of that plane go to jail in Italy or get prosecuted at all in Italy? Answer, no. Same kind of deal here. It's not so clear, and this is why it's a thorny issue, that if the National Guard or the military uses violence in any way, shape, or form on U.S. soil during a riot or a protest, that they have a level of immunity for their actions or that they'll get pardoned by the president. When you get to that point, it becomes a police state. It's no longer really like a democracy. This is why the pardon of all the January 6th people is so egregious. Is at that point, the president has his own personal military force that he can use at his discretion. If they're shown that they will be pardoned or that they're able to evade or elude any kind of justice if something awry happens, if they violate the rules of engagement in any way. That is really scary. And it looks like they're trying to normalize that kind of situation. I don't think it'll happen, but the fact that it could is in itself a part of the reason I think why there is this protest to such a degree. People see the writing on the wall. They see what's happening with the boats down in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Remember, for all these boats, it's alleged that they're doing the thing that it's alleged they're doing. And what's probably more egregious in the circumstance of the boats is that the thing they're alleged to be doing, drug smuggling, is not a capital offense in the United States. As far as I can tell, I'll make an exception to that. Pirates used to be executed. They used to be hung until dead if they engaged in piracy on the high seas. That there was a tradition of pirates getting executed. I guess you could make the argument that if they are actually drug smugglers on the open ocean, that in theory they could qualify as pirates, but that's questionable. But the point is, by blurring the line between crimes that people get executed for and crimes that they don't, essentially it's creating this normalizing system where the government says a person does a bad thing. Nobody to say, prove it, put them on trial, present the evidence, let them defend themselves. And if it's found that they're guilty, fine. Give them the appropriate punishment proportional to their crime. This situation isn't that. This situation is those are bad people. Bad people deserve to get killed. They get killed. That's the chain of logic. Taken to its logical extreme, when the government says that the people protesting are in the same category as the bad people and that the military can be used on U.S. soil, then in theory, the same actions could be taken against U.S. citizens. And then at that point, the whole system of justice we have in this country is thrown out the window. Due process, being able to confront your accusers, being told what your crimes are, being able to go to court and have a trial, and ostensibly having a chance at being found innocent or guilty of your crime. Like all of those protections that Americans assume they have by virtue of being Americans and existing in the country, being protected by the Constitution, they get thrown completely out the window if there are exceptions to that rule. And what it looks like to me, with all my years of research and understanding of the sort of complexity of what's going on, is that Trump is trying to carve out an exception in the laws and the rules for him to do that if he needs to or wants to. And that, I think, is the big reason for these protests. People are seeing what's going on, where it's going or could go. This is the moment to unequivocally say no. That is not what a democratic society governed by the rule of law does. Kings do that. Kings go, I wish to be rid of this odious priest. Will anyone help me? Or this monk, or whatever that reference is, where a king says, I want this guy gone. Oh, gone. No more. They vanish from the midst of time. They're gone. Kings do that. They do. Absolute tyrants, dictators, they do that. So Duterte in the Philippines, he would say people were drug dealers or traffickers, and then he'd throw them from helicopters, right? Like, he's currently being prosecuted for crimes against humanity in the ICC for that, for saying people were drug dealers or drug people and then executing them on the spot. No trial, no attempt to give anybody the opportunity to say, no, not me. I didn't do it. You got the wrong guy. And I think part of the issue too is that we know mistakes get made, right? If you know what the Innocence Project is, yeah, they try to see if there's people on death row or people who are charged with serious crimes, but say they're innocent. They help them to get exonerated if there are issues with DNA or if there was exculpatory evidence that was hidden, right? That a prosecutor wanted to maintain their win record, so they hid evidence that proved that someone didn't do a crime. We know already that mistakes do in fact get made, but not just mistakes, that corruption happens, right? That people have vendettas, that they make stuff up to get back at people, to get revenge, to take out a competitor, right? And the problem is that if you have no system in place to check the worst impulses of humanity, then those worst impulses get put on full display. What's very clear from this current administration is that some of the laws they don't like to follow. At least some of them. They just don't like to follow them.
It sounds to me like the way that you have carved this out is that in order for the leader of a country to have an acceptable level of authority, or let us say a level of authority that can function within a democratic system, that there has to be a right of appeal.
Yeah, exactly. So there's two things. One, an opportunity to surrender, right? So what that means is for all these drug smugglers or whatever, say, look, stop doing it. We'll leave you alone. We'll put you on trial. You won't die. There is no opportunity to surrender. If there's no opportunity to surrender, then that means that the government just says these people are what they say they are. Boom, dead. The second is a right to appeal. The second one's super important because if you have no ability within a system to check the worst impulses, then we're left with this insane system of the possibility of corruption, of just pure exercise of violence and power with no real way to limit or stop it, right? That there's no effective, the whole point of the rule of law of having a court system is that most people, right, they're not strong enough to defend themselves against the government. No people. There's a handful of people on the whole planet that have enough power to hide from a government and military as powerful as the U.S. Yes, they could go to a country that won't extradite them. But that doesn't stop the U.S. from still targeting them if they're ever on the ocean. Or we're seeing that now. But the point is that there are innocent people who get caught up in this mess. And you can never know if they're innocent if they're never even given the opportunity in any circumstance to actually have their innocence recognized. That's part of the issue.
So not just the right of appeal, but an imposition of the guarantee of the possibility of appeal.
Okay, think of it this way. In the United States, ostensibly, you're presumed innocent until proven guilty. The missing element right now from the Trump administration in the immigration raids, in that worker raid in Georgia, in the blowing up of the boats down in the Caribbean and now the Pacific, is that they're not doing the proven guilty part. They're just saying they're guilty. And the problem with just saying someone is guilty is that they might not be guilty. But if they're not guilty and they're killed, it is impossible for them to ever prove their guilt. And so you arrive in a situation where the things, the strictures, the rules that we thought were meant to protect us, the values that we're supposed to uphold, justice, fairness, morality, it's in the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Justice for all is everybody, 100%, all the time. And right now, it's not. Right now, justice is not equal for everybody. There are some people who are 100% not receiving equal access to justice. They're not getting lawyers. They're not even getting an opportunity to be heard. They're being told they are something, and then they're being ferried around or killed. So to give you an example early on, remember Kilmar Abrego Garcia, right? The government said explicitly, we made a mistake. Oopsie daisy. This guy wasn't supposed to be sent to El Salvador. So what do? Yeah. The government doesn't just go, oops, our bad, let's bring him back. No, they spend months going, well, maybe he's guilty of something, right?
Don't we have, isn't it in the Constitution that there shan't be bills of attainder?
Pretty much, yeah, I know what you're saying. Yes, essentially, search and seizure. They can't seize people without having a warrant or a writ, usually from a judge. But the point here is that we have a system, ostensibly, of justice for most people who live in the U.S., but for some people, they are 100% denied any access to justice. And to make it worse, the only way to make a claim for asylum is to do it in U.S. courts, right? That's the main way. So when they deport people to some prison in a foreign country, it removes them from the jurisdiction of the United States completely, which means that it's very difficult, if not outright impossible, for all these people who are just sent to some prison for an indeterminate amount of time. In our current system of justice, at a minimum, you're told what your crimes are, you're given a trial or a plea deal, and then you're given an exact sentence, as in you committed this crime, you served this amount of time, you paid this amount of money, and then we're done. We won't follow you around and make your life miserable anymore because you did the bad thing. But in this situation, there's no sentence. They haven't been convicted of anything. They're just told, you're bad, now you're going to be sent to a prison in the control of somebody else that is being paid by the U.S. government to hold them. So the incentive on the part of the people being holding the people, is to just say, yes, give me more money. There's zero guarantees that any of those people in the prison will ever be given a trial or ever be released. That's part of this No Kings protest, I think, is that we've got infringements on due process and civil rights and liberties and guarantees. This is the testing ground. They do this here with the immigration stuff and with the stuff on the boats, and then whittle away at the protections that American citizens have until you reach a point where they have a dictator for life. That's the fear, is that we don't have elections in 2028. Is it a founded fear? I don't know. That's a big question. But is it a fear?
Yeah, it's a fear. I don't know how to say it in a sensitive way. But they've been doing extraordinary rendition. They've been doing drone strikes. They've been doing the war on drugs. Who knows how many people die in that? It is a more dangerous thing when they catch people up in dragnets and for paperwork errors treat them in an undignified and in some cases horrific fashion. That is a different thing. Yet we are talking about treatment of individuals. It would be, I would probably say, a greater step in terms of distance, in terms of no election this time. Now, I'm never going to say, now just because that's my belief, I'm not going to If I say, oh, that's not going to happen, then that increases the danger of it happening.
January 6th did in fact happen, right?
Indeed,
so
yes.
Biden was elected,
Yeah.
and in the waning days of the first Trump administration, instead of just going, okay, I lost, Biden's president, no, an armed mob stormed the Capitol, terrified all the representatives of Congress, some of whom seem to have conveniently forgotten the fact that they were there when the Capitol got stormed and a whole bunch of people were in a place they weren't supposed to be, who all got pardoned day one of Trump 2 of the second administration. That happened already, right? There was no peaceful transfer of power. It wasn't peaceful. It was marred by violence, and a whole lot of people were prosecuted and given pretty lengthy prison sentences, and they're all out. It's bizarre. It's very bizarre. But
it makes us think about the pardoning power of the president and whether it's worth it.
Look, so to the question of whether he's acting like a king, yeah, right there. That's the acting like a king part. That the people who ostensibly encouraged, or at least, how do I put this delicately, that he didn't make as serious an effort as he could have and arguably should have to not have them invade the legislative branch of the government. He then waved a wand and pardoned, which tells me that he didn't care.
This is probably the main reason which went into the making of this podcast, is that we do see extraordinary actions of a dubious nature. And it does raise the question of, is this the decade that history turns? If the right of appeal for anyone, I don't want to exclude it exclusively say for an American citizen, but for somebody who has standing judicial, the right of appeal, if that is taken away, then we don't live in the kind of country that we were born into and that we and our forebears were blessed to inherit. So I hope that people do know, because if you win an election and then you go on and you do tax cuts and you change laws, those are the results of elections. But if you take away the legal rights of people to have legal standing, you were talking about something very different.
Yeah, but just a complete, not non sequitur, but within the category of, is Trump acting like a king? That gift of the plane, yes, acting like a king. The ballroom being funded by private donors that are looking to curry favor with the leader by spending tens of millions of dollars sure looks a lot like a king, right? That in the middle of a government shutdown where people are losing their food benefits and their support structures and their rental assistance, and in some cases getting fired from their jobs or furloughed, here's the president extolling building a $300 million ballroom and demolishing part of the people's house, the White House, right? Just doing it, just saying, I'm going to do it and doing it. It's like a let them eat cake moment of, they're just living in their Mount Olympus going, look at the people playing out their lives today. They're sheep and we are the wolves. I agree. It is a civic duty. This is the moment. Okay. You're right. Those things of that nature have happened in the past. Gitmo's still open. There has been extraordinary rendition. There have been drone strikes. But at least in those circumstances, there was an argument to be made that they were enemy combatants in a war because the country was attacked and that they were fighting. But even in those cases, some people got caught up in the dragnet, and it was found that they should have been given a trial and an opportunity to not be held in limbo forever. But if that happens for everyone, then the foundation of our society becomes really shaky, right? Because the biggest selling point of the United States to the world is that it has the rule of law, and that the rule of law is respected, that there's fairness and due process, and that it is the foundation for how we engage with each other. Because trust is everything.
Mondays with Mike.